Hello everyone! I hope everybody's super excited to jump in and start learning 3D animation. So I actually looks like some of the older versions of these videos have gone missing. So I wanted to kind of re-record them and talk a little bit about animation and kind of just explain what we're doing. So for our first assignment, we're really just doing kind of basic keyframe animation and talking about kind of how animation works inside of 3ds Max. So in this class, we modified a lot. Like, obviously, most of our 3D classes, we kind of go through a lot of revisions every year just because of the changes in the software applications and kind of workflows and different things. But here in week one, really, we're all about the basics, basic fundamentals, basic concepts, and kind of understanding animation at a really kind of introductory level. And don't worry, we're going to ramp it up, I promise. We ramp it up pretty quick, actually, in this class. You can see our next video is actually working with controllers and constraints, which adds on to this one quite a bit. So let's just jump in. I am a big fan about, jumping all in and learning while doing, right? So here we are inside of 3ds Max. If you remember from 3D graphics, we have our 4 different viewports. Top, front, left, and perspective are the default, but we can change these up to different views if we want. We can click on them and pick any of our different default views, or even create new views based off of cameras, lights, and different things. I like to work in the default views, especially in the beginning, so you kind of get used to it. Now, in 3D modeling, one thing that a lot of people have trouble with is getting used to working in 3 dimensions. And I always feel weird saying that because we live in 3 dimensions. But if you remember from the class, it can be a bit challenging to kind of wrap your mind around working in 3D because we're working from a 3D universe through a 2D interface within another 3D universe. And that's weird, right? Again, it's kind of an odd and somewhat unnatural way of interacting with 3D. There are actually several different companies and programs that are right now that are working on changing 3D animation and 3D modeling to be more intuitive by bringing the models into kind of a 3rd dimension. So if you look at like Apple's headset, the idea of spatial computing to kind of remove that sort of artificial 2-dimensional barrier is kind of happening. So, all right. So let's get in here. Let's start working. So I've just basically done 2 things. I have created a sphere, and I've created a plane for us to kind of play with. So you can see there is no like collision or anything fancy kind of happening. We literally just have a sphere and a plane that I've thrown together right before I started recording this video. If you remember from 3D graphics, we have our control gizmo. Now, in 3D graphics, we introduced the idea of the control gizmo and the idea of the move, the rotate, and the scale. Inside of 3ds Max, we can actually animate keyframes on all 3 of these: move, rotate, and scale. Just like in 3D modeling, I kind of warn against the scale tool. The same thing is kind of true in here. Most of you taking this class are game design students, and you're going to be creating things for video game engines. Animating along the scale keys can create some really weird and ugly things. So while we have to be aware of it, we're going to have to get used to it. It's not fun. It's not very good to play with. For this week, definitely, if we want to kind of move around, experiment in here and view it, we can. We're not going to be exporting this to a game engine right now. We're just kind of learning. And so for this assignment, I really don't mind at all if you're kind of playing around with the scale tool. Just keep in mind, funky things start happening when we start dealing with the scale tool. When we start exporting out of Max, we're trying to bring it into a game engine or bring it into spatial. I know some of you have come off from 3D graphics where we're working with spatial.io and have had some weirdnesses happen because of scaling. So just a heads up. So the easiest way to really jump in here is to turn on auto key. Once you turn on auto key, you can think of this as a record, right? 3ds Max is ready to start recording whatever you do. Now the other thing we need to really look at this time that really didn't look at in modeling, is the timeline down here. So by default, the first thing I want to mention is your timeline is set to 100 frames. Okay? Generally speaking, if we render this out as a video clip, most video runs at somewhere between 24 and 30 frames per second. A lot of video games will actually run at 60 frames per second. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you with math and 3D graphics. I kind of mentioned this a lot. You know, we are dealing with a lot of math. So as long as we respect it and understand its math, we don't have to do the calculations. This is a calculator. But we do want to understand that, you know, we're working with mathematics. We're working with, you know, Cartesian coordinate systems. We're having to kind of understand that we're interacting with those numbers. Okay. So again, not wanting to scare anybody off, but at the same time, you know, that's what we're dealing with. So the first things first, if I want to move this ball from moving this location to over here, let's say, I'm going to need to move my timeline. If I don't, if I just grab the ball and move it, you know, nothing happens. You know, if I hit play, there's nothing happening because I moved the ball at frame 0. So, you know, it didn't do anything. If I want the ball to actually move within time, I need to move, let's say, to frame 20, my ball, and make sure it's on a different frame. Now, if you notice, keyframes just popped in. Here we go. And it automatically creates my animation. So now I have an animation that's 20 frames long, going from 0 to 20. So I guess that's 21. But here we go. And there it is. Now, notice it'll only animate in whatever viewport is selected. So if I right-click in this view, and again, while left-clicking is fine, right-clicking will allow you to switch views without deselecting anything. When you're regular clicking, it's really easy to grab something else or click on something. So anyway, you can see here, only the active view is going to animate, and you can see the ball moving from one spot to another along 20 frames. And that's it. Pretty easy stuff, right? I'm going to go ahead and pause the animation here. So you can see there it is. Now, also take note, oh, my picture is kind of in the way. Apologize. Let's see if I can shrink this down a little. Oh, my computer is freaking out. I did not like that. All right, so I didn't think about my little face down in the corner here. Here are the keys, and they are red. So I want you to be able to see that because you can't really see 0. To make this actually a little bit even easier, I'm going to go ahead and just move and play head. And I'm going to move my keys down to frame 40. So we're not, or we'll say 30. So we're not having to fight with the little picture-in-picture business. So, and you got to see how easy it was to move those keys. So you can see now, I just moved the keys from 30 to 50 here. It's still a 20-frame animation, and it moves back and forth. Okay. And anything that happens before 30, we're really not going to see. This is going to be a little bit funky because normally I would be showing you at 0 and my big face is on over 0, but it's okay. Doesn't matter. I'm going to move the playhead to another frame. Doesn't matter what frame we pick as long as it's not the same ending frame, so we can kind of see it here. And then I'm going to use the rotate tool, and I'm going to come over here and just rotate the sphere a little bit. Now, this probably won't be too noticeable because the sphere isn't that, you know, easy to see. But you'll see that my key was created now is green. Now, if you still have your starting key on frame 0, you'll probably see that the frame on 0 will actually have a red stripe and a green stripe. It looks like that when you have more than one animation key in the exact same frame. So because I moved my, you know, movement keys over, my frame 0, you know, again, doesn't look striped. It just looks green because I technically only have rotation there. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab my sphere again, move our playhead, I don't know, say 40 or so, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to use the scale tool and scale it up. So you can see here it is. Whoop. And I've got all 3 animations. Now the big thing I want you to notice is in the bottom is we have 3 different colors: green, red, and blue. So red keys are movement keys or motion keys, green keys are rotation keys, and scale keys are blue. And if you have them all stacked on top of each other, so again, if I would have started all of these animations at the same frame, you know, normally that would be 0. let's go ahead and just move them. I'm going to move them all here to frame 25 so you can see what I'm talking about. And this will probably look the same as on your machine. So now on frame 25, you can see there I have all 3 keys piled up on top of each other, and they look like stripes. Now it's easy to move the keys around. When they're piled on top of each other, it can be a little tricky because you can't just move one anymore. You'll move them all as a block. Now that doesn't mean we're stuck there. We can absolutely modify those keys, but in our normal default timeline, once you stack them on top of each other, they kind of more or less kind of go in like a folder, and they're kind of linked. Now, that doesn't mean we can't unlink them or modify them or edit them further. It just means our default timeline, which we can do a lot of animation just on this timeline without having to go into any advanced views or anything. But once they're stacked up, we have to access them in a more advanced way. So one of the ways we can do that is we can click the key and right click on it, and you can actually see here are all my keyframes. And I can delete it as well. Notice here, sphere 1, which is my ball I made. Right now, by default, it's actually adding a keyframe for all of the different information values. So scale is by itself, but the rotation and the movement keys actually make keyframes for auto key on the X, the Y, and the Z information. So it's basically noting the exact spot in 3-dimensional space. Again, all of our dimensions, X, Y, and Z keyframe. So it has the exact spot within space for that and the exact rotation within space for that. So again, our X, Y, and Z rotations are kind of based on its rotation information and its position information, then our scale there. So this, again, it seems like there's a lot going on. Play with it would be my advice. If you're just watching this video before actually being in Max, it probably seems complicated. You jump in Max, you turn on auto key, you move the thing around, bingo bango, you're done. So, definitely play with it and don't be intimidated by the information. There's a lot, but trust me, it gets easy. Now, if we want to see this animation, there are other ways we can view it than just our default timeline. We can actually go to graph editors, for example, and do like our dope sheet. Now the dope sheet, you can kind of think of it as an expanded view of this timeline. Okay, it has lots of advanced features to it. Notice here, there's my sphere 1, and there are my keys that look just like they do down here. See? Samey, samey. All right, but I can hit the little plus sign and open up these transform controller, the position controller, the rotation controller, and the scale controller, and view the keys all spread out. So the dope sheet, it's just like your timeline at the bottom, but you can expand it out to view all the stuff you've made. So auto key made keyframes for the X, the Y, and the Z axes, and the X rotation, the Y rotation, the Z rotation for the rotation controller. And here they are. And now in here, if I wanted to, I could just grab the Y position and move it. Okay. Now, it's not going to do a whole lot in the animation we made down here because I just moved the thing over. But if you had it moving along all 3 dimensions, you could delete keys. If you didn't want it to rotate against one of the axes, if you only wanted to rotate it one way, let's say you were doing tires for a car and you only wanted them to rotate along, I don't know, the Y axis or the X axis, and you wanted to keep it that way, or Z axis, whatever axis is the right axis, depending on how you made your tire, and you only want it to rotate, so you don't have to worry about it getting wobbly. You could delete the keys out completely, so it would only rotate along the one axis. Same thing with the movement controller. If you wanted it to only move along the X position or only along the Y, oh, looks like I have a meeting popping up, you can do that as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, the other thing I want to show you real quick, it's okay if I'm late for my meeting, is the other graph editor is the curve editor. Now this is just another way of viewing the exact same information, so don't think that we're looking at anything else. Oh, I didn't want to dock that there, dang it. Come on, undock. Sorry. 3ds Max thought I wanted to dock it in that spot. It's very editable, the interface here. Let me go ahead and close this ribbon as well. Alright, so here you can see these lines are the actual curve representation of the animation we just made. And notice they're not straight. that's the one thing I definitely want to point out is even though we auto keyed it, by default Max actually adds a little bit of an ease in and ease out. If you've watched the video for the principles of animation, you'll know that those are one of the principles. So it actually already kind of anticipates that in here. Sometimes that's not what we want. Sometimes it is. So again, we can modify the curve as well to have an animation speed up or slow down and really fine tune it. Okay. You can also view that view very quickly by clicking the little button. It's behind my picture right now, but right next to the timeline all the way over to the edge. If you click it, it'll actually expand the timeline down here and to look like a curve editor. So you can do that as well. So, and you can choose it to curve editor, dope sheet, etc. You can kind of play around with it. Oops. I need to lock my interface. All these things are falling apart. All right. So hopefully that's kind of making sense for you. You can kind of see that you can really play around with these different elements. We have just all kinds of fun tools and toys and different things to play around inside of Max to fine tune these. So for this lesson, really, I'm just wanting you to kind of play with auto key and basic frames, animations, animate along the scale, animate along the move and the rotate, and just feel comfortable with this. Okay, that's pretty much it. All right, I think I say, you know, making a ball bounce is kind of a great way of doing that. But I'm pretty flexible. You know, it's more about practicing with these tools. Of course, let me know if you have any questions, and hopefully this is fun.